With opening our session, my name is Denis Ramodin. I'm a curator and a moderator of this session. So today we're talking about the heritage of the 20th century. So this kind of topic usually generates a lot of emotions among the general public. It leads to a lot of arguments between professionals. So what do we need to preserve? What do we consider our legacy, our heritage? So let me introduce our speakers today. The first speaker is Floris Alkemade, the chief national architect of the Netherlands, Misha Gross, co-founder of Bauhaus Center, Tel Aviv, Anna Bronavisk. She is the director of the Institute of Modernity, lecturer of the Marsh School. Well, since we're still waiting for the first speaker, what is happening with our cultural heritage? You know that in Moscow we do have a positive example. The Narkomfin house renovations is starting. The Izvestia building, the renovation, the restoration of the Izvestia building has almost been finished, but we still have a lot of landmarks that are part of our heritage, and a lot of these landmarks are under threat. So the good news for Moscow is that the new Arbat is now considered our cultural heritage because it generated a lot of issues back in the time. So now I have a question to Alexei. So Moscow has developed a system of criteria that allows us to designate what is a part of our cultural heritage. On the one side, people say that landmarks of the 20th century have only a tiny chance to end up on the heritage list, but these buildings are also part of our history, our culture, the history of our architecture. If we look at the international experience, then London is running a number of programs to preserve the buildings that were built in the 20th century. There is a similar program in the Netherlands and in Tel Aviv. So what is the situation like in Moscow? And when we talk about architectural styles of the 20th century, will we consider them our cultural heritage? What will become with them in Moscow, and what we're doing for the preservation and conservation? Good afternoon. Well, it is a great honor for me to talk about the preservation of our cultural heritage, especially as a part of the Moscow Urban Forum. As you all know, Moscow is a city that has cultural heritage dating back to different periods, 16th century, 18th centuries, and the 20th century. Well, for me, the 20th century is extremely valuable. You know, the 20th century was not easy for this country. We had 3 world wars. We had the Russian Revolution. We had the Second World War, and everything happened here, and Moscow was part of it. But if we look at the history of this country, the turn of the century from the 1900 to 1915, the time of modernity, neoclassicism, and even if we do not consider the largest communal buildings or banking institutions that were built back at that time, what this period means for us is that new types of heritage emerge. For instance, Moscow rail terminals, 6 out of 9 rail terminals in Moscow are part of Moscow cultural heritage. Moscow Circular Railroad, it is our favorite project, and about 100 buildings were designated as cultural heritage. These buildings are unique for Moscow. If we look at industrial buildings, we have absolutely breathtaking industrial buildings in Moscow, and we are rightly proud of them. For instance, the Red October factory or Vodopribor factory, all of these buildings absolutely superb examples of this period from 1900 to 1915. Then some years pass, and in the 1920s, in this country and in this city, constructivist buildings appeared. And again, they're so unique. They're unlike anything else that we have ever seen. Again, these buildings were erected at a time that was extremely difficult for the country, but world-renowned architects came here, and these structures were built. They're administrative buildings. They're clubs for the proletariat. And again, all of these buildings are part of our cultural heritage. Then again, a few years go by, and we have the Moscow Metro. 44 stations of the Moscow Metro are our cultural heritage. They're absolutely unique landmarks. Today, we all know that the Moscow Metro is the most important system of mass transit in Moscow, but still, these 44 stations are our heritage. They are something we're proud of. Then again, some time goes by. We have the Stalin Empire style. You know the Seven Sisters in Moscow, and again, this turns yet another page in the history book of this country, part of our cultural heritage, built in the 20th century. Again, a few years go by, we have modernist architecture, unlike anything that's been before. And here I have to mention the Pioneer Palace, the Montreal Pavilion, and Zelenograd, the town of Zelenograd, the Moscow Institute of Electronics in Zelenograd. Right now, our department is considering assigning cultural heritage to that building. So for me personally and for my department, the 20th century is extremely important. It is very interesting, and I think each one of these buildings should be preserved. You asked me about criteria. Well, I have to tell you that all of the criteria that we use, they had been carefully discussed by experts and professionals, and I don't think there are too many risks here. Usually we use two criteria: the uniqueness of the building and whether in its originality, whether it was something that was built initially. So if it is unique, either for our country or for our city, if it is authentic, and if it is something that we are proud of, then we will consider it cultural heritage, and we will do everything to preserve it. Thank you very much. You know, this country and this city has a lot of issues when it comes to restoration of these non-classical buildings. Of course, we do have a number of good examples, such as Izvestia building, which was transferred into a business center. Here I have a question for Anna Bronovitska. The situation is not so clear-cut with avant-garde in this country, but at least we understand the value of avant-garde. There are some reconstruction projects, but when it comes to modernist architecture, then the situation is completely different, because people view this post-war era as mass housing, as typical projects. So we had trouble explaining it to people what is so unique about these buildings. And now we have the Institute of Modernist Architecture. People are starting to talk about the beauty of architecture of that period. But, you know, a lot of these buildings had been revamped. A lot of them had been refurbished. So my question is, what do we concentrate on when it comes to modernist architecture? Which buildings should we preserve? Is it mass public housing, or should we pay more attention to individual, unique buildings? Or if you look at these revamped buildings, can we restore them back to its original form? And what do we do in order to see whether there is value in these modernist buildings? Thank you very much, Denise, for such a thought-provoking question. And I think that Alexei managed to answer this question, at least in part. So I would like to address you. So let's stop repeating this mantra that this is something that is unacceptable for the general public. I think by saying this, we're basically disrespecting the public. The public includes people of different preferences and opinions, and there are a lot of people who are very interested in this modernist heritage. I was in Nizhny Novgorod a couple of days ago. They have an exhibition going on, Gorky and modernism. There are tours that are being organized for the public. So what I saw there, a lot of elderly people going on these tours. And one of the ladies told me that I always looked at this architecture of the 1960s, 1970s as something that has no value. But now I view it completely differently. So I think our job here is to educate the public. In the 1960s and 1970s, a lot of fantastic, superb buildings had been built, and I published a book with Yuli Plemenoy and Nikolai Malinin about 18 months back. In that book, we tried to look at everything that was built in Moscow in the 1960s, 1970s, and the 1980s. The question here is, do we need to assign such an official cultural heritage status to these structures? You all know what it is. This is the Garage, a modern art museum. This is a reconstruction of a modernist restaurant, and this reconstruction couldn't have been carried out if the building was designated as cultural heritage. But what you can see here, you see that Remco, the famous Dutch architect, he changed the facade, but he managed to preserve the internal space. And he was very careful in restoring all of the interior elements while adjusting the building to carry out a new function. So maybe we have to introduce a scale for these sites, for these buildings. So it's not just heritage or non-heritage. Maybe it should be more of a sliding scale. So please stop me if I'm running out of time. So what do I... So somebody mentioned the Pioneer Palace, which is a part of the architectural heritage. But this official status does not protect everything that happens around the landscape design. So again, when we're dealing with the beautification of the landscape, a lot of things are being destroyed. Or here you see an example. It's a museum should protect its building. This is the panorama of the Brodino battle, and I'm a bit worried what's going to happen. This is a very deplorable situation. This was the building that was built in the 1980s. This is the work of a renowned architect, Leonid Pavlov. So this is the pavilion for the mourning train that was built to mourn Lenin. So this belongs to the Russian Railroad Company. And the Russian Railroad Company, they have a booth at the Biennale in Venice. They are announcing that they have a lot of unique architecture under its management, but here they completely fail to understand the value. But of course, it's quite clear that this frontal part of the Kursk rail terminal will be demolished, and it basically sends us to Rome and Venice. We're also worried about the Moscow department store. It's a historical department store, has the same value as the GUM department store on Red Square. Or for instance, look at this dormitory. This is the Rasterman dormitory, the new proletariat living dormitory. it doesn't have the official status. Our office buildings can be revamped at any point in time, but I do believe that this building is owned by the mayor's office. And look at this. You see that the exterior facade is one thing, but these buildings have very valuable interiors. They are home to a number of works of monumental art. So these workers' canteen, it exists, but it's full of vending machines and everything is obscured from view. Look at this stained glass work in the Institute of Oceanology. This itself is part of the cultural heritage and it is protected, unlike the building itself. So this is a good example, and I think that the fact that we actually are starting to protect monumental art together with the buildings or even separately from the buildings, I think that this is a tradition that should be carried forward. Thank you very much. Yeah, this issue that you touched upon is quite complicated. What do we do about these buildings? How do we give them a different function? For instance, these Seasons restaurants where some of the elements were preserved. But here I have a question to Floris Alkimadze. How is this issue tackled outside of Russia? We know that in Europe there are a number of glorious examples how these buildings of post-Second World War era were revamped, or how they're serving a different function right now. So there are good examples of restoration. So, can you tell us a little bit about it? Maybe give us a couple of examples. On the one hand, the restoration of post-war buildings, and so maybe the examples of reconstruction or revamping of these buildings while preserving interior and exterior elements.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. And I was very impressed by the two earlier speakers, how well they value this legacy of these buildings. And I have to say, in the Netherlands, every architect is trained with the examples of the constructivists in Russia, and also with the buildings of the communist era. So it's part of the language we teach in the Netherlands, our architects. When it comes to legislation, or when it comes to the legacy, I think it's important to understand that it's about generations. And I used here the example of Shakespeare, Hamlet, talking to the spirit of his father. And I think that's how we should look at preservation. It's a dialogue. It's not a monologue of the other generation. So that means that every generation should have its own say when talking about the buildings that came from the other generations. And of course, if you look like this example, old castles, we do understand the value, we do understand the historical notion. But I think it's important that we also look at much more recent buildings and try to understand what can we do with them, because sometimes they do not have that beauty, they do not have that immediate appreciation. Yet we have numerous buildings like this that are no longer in use, that need to find a new function. I show 4 examples, and I already can explain to you that all of these 4 buildings have been maintained in different ways. If you look at the one at the lower right corner, an office building in the city of Eindhoven, it became part of a redevelopment area based on creative high-tech industries, and where all these buildings offer a kind of new identity in the old architecture. So they're not preserved in a way that they restore to every little detail, but they offer cheap places, available places for the younger generation who have not a lot of money, but they add creativity to it. And all of a sudden, the vacant buildings become a hub for new evolutions. I think important example. Later this year, September, November, we have an exhibition of about the work of Dutch architects on transformation projects. It will be here in Moscow, afterwards in St. Petersburg, where we list a series of these transformations. And I think the common part is always that our own generation adds something to it. It's not restoration like, okay, there is no change possible. It's the dialogue I talked about, interventions that deal with the buildings. This is also an example in the Netherlands, examples that are discussed a lot. What to do with old churches. Religion is reclining, so we have a lot of church buildings no longer in use. So big debate is, can we use them for other functions, commercial functions? Big debates, yet in order to be able to keep the buildings, to maintain the buildings, we try other functions. Functions with a lot of respect for the original architecture. So these are bookstores in old churches, and they do not touch the building. It's like furniture put in the church, therefore they get a new meaning, a new function, and they generate enough money to keep them in the perfect condition. So it's restoration and transformation simultaneously. Of course, different examples. An example I was involved in Germany, the Zollverein, a former industrial area. 1985, the buildings closed down, the mines closed down. They wanted to demolish the buildings, but then realized that the buildings had a value. And we were asked to promote a master plan and also to see if the existing buildings could be reused. Not an easy task, buildings that were in decay. But we managed to restore them, but in order to do that, we added elements in order to make the buildings function for another program than industrial. But we said whatever we add as our generation will be very visible. So like these staircases we added, they added a new layer to that building. Like the escalator we added on the outside. Only one visible sign of the new program. Something which changed an entire identity without compromising the historical tissue. Something you can do, an iconic way of dealing with it. And as such, transforming an entire culture. Of course, the Germans always ask me, why did you do that in orange? Is that the new energy? But of course, it's a greeting from the Netherlands. Orange as our national color. But somehow you can maintain historical structures by transforming them. And we even managed to convince UNESCO to make the project a World Heritage project. A totally different project I'm involved in as a chief government architect, and a prison in the Netherlands. The Netherlands crime is declining for the last decades, which means we can no longer fill our prisons. We simply have not enough criminals anymore. So we have to sell these properties. And in this particular case, the buildings were not in a good condition. There was also a lot of asbestos in, so the buildings had to be destroyed. But we said, let's not sell the property just for the highest bid, but let's sell it combined with a new plan. So we managed to have a procedure where the quality of the new program would be valued as much as the financial bid. So in the end, we could sell it not to the highest bid, but to the guys who made, in the end, the best plan. So you can steer quality also by having other claims. A project I also was involved in Paris, in a warehouse, 1968. A strange building. It's 616 meters long. It's totally madness. And everybody hated the building. It blocked everything, and they had a competition to see what to do with the building. We won the competition because we were one of the few people who proposed not to cut up the building in pieces, but to keep it in its entire length and actually to add something to it. We found that the structure was strong enough to carry other floors. So we made a building where the existing building was maintained and then added a lot of stories with dwellings, offices, schools, enormous capacity to add new program to the city of Paris. And making it sustainable by not demolishing that, what people thought would be ugly, but actually integrating it in new structures. Something you can do as long as you take freedom to have your own generation, and give it a way of adding elements to these structures. So it's about the dialogue between generations. And then you can find qualities in these existing structures that are enormous. The building is not only 600 meters long, but 80 meters wide. So we can have inner gardens on the roofs. A quality normally in Paris would be absolutely impossible to generate in this way, becoming part of Paris all of a sudden. To conclude, I think it's important that when looking back at the history, even in history as rich, as multi-layered as the Russian history, that we always do realize that we should not be disappointed in our own time and age. We should believe in it and see in what way we can work with it. In that sense, I think all these buildings, whether they are beautiful or not, they have a future if you add imagination, if you add the power of design, and you can reprogram them in a way that they give identity and a kind of richness to a city as a dialogue. Thank you. Yeah.
И тогда у меня вопрос.
And then I have a question to Alexei. Well, let's say we have very good program, 1 ruble per square meter, which is working in our city, but that relates to only particular buildings. But if we talk about residential areas and residential districts, like small districts which were built in post-war times, like district number 9 in Chernomorski. So what should we do with those districts? And again, in Europe and here in Russia, we have a completely different real estate management system. And abroad, we can find excellent examples, like in Cologne, for example, when a city renovated and restored an entire district. But now this district is being leased out. But the point is that the buildings acquired the look they had before the war, and also there are good examples of restoring an entire district based on EU financing. What should we do with districts here in Moscow? Because this is one of the topics of discussion, because architects are looking way to preserve this heritage on one hand and make it money-making for the city and for developers. And we have examples of post-war district development, which are no good. We have good examples when the managers of these buildings unite and somehow turn it around. So what should we do with these buildings? Thank you very much. And to start with, I'd like to continue the ideas of our previous speakers like Anna and Flores. I think Anna was right when she said that we shouldn't get focused on protecting particular buildings, like modernistic buildings, for example, because if we assign a status of a monument to a building, then a lot of things in terms of restoration become impossible. So by law, you cannot touch this building. But in both cases, which I mentioned, which were previously mentioned here, these are good examples of a very talented restoration, of very talented handling of modernistic buildings. And Flores made a very good point. We've all mentioned that it's not so much about preserving modernistic buildings. It is about transforming them. It's about changing their size. It's about giving them a new functionality. And we all realize that in line with existing legislation, it's impossible to do these things to a monument. So that's clear. We need to be more careful about it. We need to study it more. We need to look into the details. We need to get a feel of the value of these buildings. If we look back into history, then I would say that relatively not very long ago, we didn't have very good understanding of what Russian modern culture was about. And historians of modernistic movements, they also did not fully accept this as a fully fledged cultural movement. After some time, it gained acceptance. But similar questions were also asked about the constructivism, because people said that it is impossible to preserve. It's a kind of an industrial architecture, but we are restoring these buildings now. We are preserving them. And you mentioned the building of the commissariat of the finance. Like 7 or 8 years ago, it will be unthinkable that this building will be restored. But they will be restored. These buildings will be restored. Next year, a fully restored building of commissariat of finance will be there in Moscow and will be leased out. So I think that this is a heritage of the 20th century, and we start understanding that it has value, and we can be proud of these buildings. And if you take Palace of Pioneers as an example, at the street of Kosygin, by 2022, the building will be restored, and this is the result of our efforts. And Montreal Pavilion will also be restored, I think, because there is a project for that. I think that with our colleagues from Zelenograd, we will also find ways to restore the famous building of Institution of Electronics. So we'll be moving in that direction. And I just want to reiterate my point. We don't have to protect these buildings. We need to be careful in handling them. We need to look into the details and see what is the best for these buildings. I hope that this House of Pioneers will finally be lucky. Recently, it's got a new director with good experience of operating these buildings. My question is to Mr. Gross. How did they build the economic model of preserving cultural heritage buildings in Tel Aviv? And to what extent the World Heritage status prevented the restoration process? So how did they work with it?
For giving us a possibility to speak about the situation in Tel Aviv. I think it was very interesting to hear the history here in Moscow and in Holland. So we are in another part of the world. We have similar problems and also very different actual situations. If I think, for example, that a church would be changed into a library, it's impossible in the Middle East to change churches or synagogues or a mosque into a library. We are not there now. But still, we have some similar problems, of course, in the restoration with modern architecture. So I would like to show you some information. Yeah, that is the city of Tel Aviv, and you see the blue spots. That would be the buildings, we call them international style or the modernistic style. They have been constructed through the 30s and 40s, so a little bit later than in Europe. The yellow part on the map you see, that's what the UNESCO called the buffer zone. So all in all, the White City is a World Heritage Site, and it concludes actually only about 7% of the whole city of Tel Aviv. It has been influenced by the spirits of the Bauhaus School in Germany, of Erich Mendelssohn, influential architect, modernist who came to Palestine, then of Le Corbusier. He never came to Palestine in this, but his students came to Palestine and constructed, and then we have the Belgian schools of architecture and engineering which were of importance. Now, what is our main problem? That is, in the 1980s, the city, the white city, got more and more neglected. People left it, and as you can see here, the plaster of the buildings were in very bad situation. People closed, for example, the balconies. They added on the existing buildings additional floors, and so on. So it was quite chaotic. If you compare it to the situation in the 1930s, so you cannot believe what happened here. So that's the situation. Now in 2003, the White City got a World Heritage Site. All in all, Tel Aviv has about 400,000 inhabitants, and a quarter of them are living in the heritage area. That's also, of course, very important to understand what are we speaking about, and how can we deal with such a situation. In the White City, we have about 4,000 buildings which have been constructed in this time period from 1930 until 48. That's what we call the modernist, Tel Aviv modernist area. And half of these 4,000 buildings, about 2,000, are under preservation law. And now the third very important point is that these buildings, in a huge majority, are privately owned. So we don't have official or municipality buildings, or very rare. Most of them are privately owned. So you can already imagine in which direction my talk will continue. One of the biggest problems is to convince the private owners of the buildings to agree to renovate them. And then they will say, yeah, but if we have to renovate it, we would like to get some help. But the municipality is not so interested in giving help, as you know, also all over the world. And now the third point is maybe what Anna was talking about, that is the meaning of modernism for the average population. Anna is very optimistic. She says that a lot of people are interested. We are a bit less optimistic, unfortunately, and we see that people don't really love the modernism. They love the Baroque, they love the eclectic style, the classic style, but at the moment when we come with modernism, so they are a bit afraid, let's say this way. So how does the municipality of Tel Aviv help the renovation? They said, we give to the to the owners of the buildings rights to add additional floors. So you understand, we have the protected building, and if somebody is ready to renovate it, he is allowed to add an additional floor. And you see both the smileys, they show us that we have a win-win situation, because the owner of the building has not to pay for the renovation, because he can sell the additional floor he is allowed to construct. And the municipality is also very happy, because they don't have to pay. That's the renovation will be paid by the owner of these additional parts. And here we can see some examples of how it works. You see this building is a dwelling, it has been renovated, we say lege artis, as it has been before, without addition. In this case, this building right has been sold to the skyscraper you can see on the back. So the skyscraper was allowed to add 2 additional floors, and with the money, the house owners of this dwelling building could renovate it, and that is the result. Here we have another example of a building where you can see the addition. It is in a step back of the main facade. Yes, you can see this. The renovation architect, he changed the color of the plaster. The plaster of the building is brown or gray-brown, and the addition is white. It is in a step back, so you don't really see the addition so good from the street. And the additional is also in another shape. As you can see, it is round and not in the right angles as the building. And this is another example. Of course, one can discuss it very extensively. You see, the building is, of course, out of concrete. It's a modernistic building. It has 3 floors. And now the additions is made out of different material. It's wood, it's glass, and it's steel, and it has a different shape. So in this case, the architect of the renovation, he absolutely wants to show us what is new and what is old. So now the field of the Bauhaus Center is actually to try to convince the population of the importance of modernist architecture. So there are different ways it can be done. The Bauhaus Center organizes tours explaining the modernist architecture within the White City. It holds exhibitions, it publishes books, merchandise, and so on. So some examples. This would be the exhibition space of the Bauhaus Center. And this is a tour, so you will see, so why is he saying there's not enough interest for modernism? This tour was made 2 years ago, I think, but the secret is that it was free of charge. So usually people have to pay for the tours and we have less success. And here are some publications. You can see we also really want to show the people what is modernism of Tel Aviv. You have the preservation and renewal publication, for example. We have one of the inside of modernistic architecture, but we showed also once the eclectic style architecture in Tel Aviv or in different cities of the country. And an example may be interesting for you. We have a publication about Bauhaus in Birobidzhan. Birobidzhan was planned to be the Jewish capital of Soviet Union, and the second director of the Bauhaus school, he was not at all Jewish, but he was a communist. He left Germany, came to Moscow, and got the job to plan the Jewish capital in Birobidzhan. And we found these plans and made out of this fascinating subject an exhibition. So this is rather simple things, but it shows you also how we try to convince our public that the modernism has also not only a rational part, but also an emotional part. And that's the way we try to get better understanding. So you can see this Malevich kind of puppets, or the Kandinsky style of the coffee cups and so on. We have toys and watches and so on. So we try to convince people.
Yes.
Now, that would be the conclusions.
Thank you very much. Вот здесь как раз
Well, here I have an interesting question about how do we popularize it, and Anna wants to add something. Well, actually, what I wanted to add is that I wanted to address Alexei. And maybe, Alexei, maybe you misunderstand me. Popularization is very important, but it should work hand in hand with the law. So the heritage of the 20th century, which is not considered as cultural heritage, it should also be protected by the law. So we have to develop legal instruments so that all of the renovations or demolitions are subject to stringent control. And when it comes to Moscow, then we have the Avant-Garde Architectural Center. We have a number of public lectures, exhibitions in the Museum of Architecture, in the ZIL Cultural Center, and we organize a lot of tours. And I know that a number of publishing projects are being carried out and research projects as well. When we discover new architects, for instance, it was about the house that was built in the Basman dead end, when the researchers carried out a large study together with their colleagues and friends. It was a study about this building, and we see a lot more of such enthusiasts in Moscow. There is a whole community that is called Red Buildings Community. They communicate on Instagram, so they're doing whatever they can to preserve this heritage. So I have a question to Floris, actually. Are there such examples in the Netherlands when it comes to popularizing the heritage, when it comes to preservation efforts through appealing to the general public, when we have publications or merchandise? Do you have this in Holland?
I think in the Netherlands there's a broad interest for architecture, and people see it as part of their culture. And currently we are having a lot of debates about recent monuments, especially the housing projects, the post-war housing projects. When the population of the Netherlands was increasing at a rapid pace, we had to construct a vast amount of new dwellings. And they all breathe a kind of optimism, but construction-wise, they're not so sound. So it's a difficult heritage. Also not so easy to discover the beauty of it. But nevertheless, what we see now is that it's not so much the cities, not the government of the cities, but the population itself that starts to get an interest. And so it's slowly, but it's emerging, and people start to realize that also these recent architectural heritage is part of the identity of a culture. And again, the question is, okay, how can we give it a new future? And in all the cases, it's indeed important to protect the real highlights, but it is as important to have also the rest of these buildings to give it a meaning. And sometimes you have to demolish parts of it, but in the end, the awareness in the public is something you can cultivate. In that sense, it's very important to have exhibitions, to have tours, to explain people what it means. It's something you can build on. And in that sense, I'm also optimistic about what you can achieve. Having said that, it's a matter of timing is important, because it's always, of course, major developers having a different agenda and have the need to make money fast. So they have other focus points, other interests, and you can damage a lot in a very short time. So you need to be precise, you need to be exact about how you value the heritage.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think what's also important is to inform the people about what's happening when it comes to the restoration of cultural heritage. And I have to say that things are going quite well when it comes to informing the public in Russia and informing different departments in the municipal government. But I think my question here is to Alexei. Do you think it's possible to establish a dialogue with private investors, with owners of these buildings, with people who are leasing these buildings? So we establish a dialogue between all stakeholders, so the renovation is not done behind the scaffolding, but so that people come out and participate in an open discussion, maybe together with the inhabitants of a city, together with the professional community, so that people who live in the city actually are informed about what's happening, especially when we're not talking about very prominent landmarks. I think this sort of information is vital, and if it is widely accessible, then it removes a lot of issues that can potentially be generated. Well, to start off, I would like to talk about how important it is to inform the public, to popularize this heritage. So we do a lot of inspections, we do a lot of probing, we do a lot of expert reviews, and all of these things and actions are extremely effective and important. But I would like it to be not even 10% of our work, when 90% of our work should be about informing the public, so that more people know about the history of our city, more people know about the architecture, so that people can criticize us, ask us questions. We are very open. We are open to the harshest of criticisms. But when we understand that this is something that comes from the heart, when we see that people are not indifferent, then we are extremely happy to respond. And so we are trying to work hand in hand with such enthusiasts. And again, when it comes to openness, it is absolutely true that it is crucial when it comes to unique landmarks. It's crucial for the general vector of the development of the city. We have to be open. We have to be transparent. This is something that we are striving to achieve. Well, maybe we're not entirely successful yet, but this is the vector of our development. Thank you very much. And to conclude our today's discussion, I would like to summarize by saying that maybe if we have a slightly different understanding of the cultural heritage from the 20th century, and you know, this understanding is not something that appears overnight. It's sort of comes in waves and stages. When we maybe the Stalinist architecture is a little bit different because it's very easy to understand. It's monumental. It's very visual. So it's associated. No, people used to hate it, you know. 20 years ago, people used to hate Stalinist architecture. Well, okay, people hated it, but I think the general public loved it because it was pretty symmetrical. And even when these buildings were getting old, just as when the classical buildings are getting old, they age beautifully. Then, of course, a new vector emerged, the architecture of the second half of the 20th century. So maybe the postmodernist architecture will be viewed differently. I think this is also something that is starting to emerge. So the issue is quite complicated here. How do we renovate it? How do we change it? What do we preserve? Do we need to revamp it? Which buildings should be renovated? What should be preserved? And maybe we should just leave certain elements intact. And again, this issue is not so clear-cut. And when we're talking about the Russian practice, this presents a completely new level of complexity. How do we renovate? How do we restore all of it? It is especially relevant because we still do not have an institute that would allow us to have a unified approach to restoration of this heritage, and we do not have technical recommendations about the preservation of this cultural heritage in this city and in this country. I would like to thank all of the speakers and all of the delegates, and I would like to thank the audience. Thank you very much.